Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Bramadet, and I'm the Director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at UVic. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first lecture of our regular CSRS lecture series for 2021. As well, I'd like to welcome you to the second of 5 John Albert Hall lectures, which began in December and wrap up at the end of March. For over the last 15 years, the John Albert Hall lectures and special events have given us an opportunity to work with friends and collaborators in the Anglican Diocese of Islands and Inlets. Our commitment is to working together to host speakers and special events that appeal to curious religious insiders and secular outsiders, lay people and clergy, scholars, and regular folks. The John Albert Hall lectures this year give us a chance to reflect critically on some of the troubling aspects of our societies that we now see more clearly than ever before in light of the pandemic. Each lecture or discussion reflects the background and interests of the scholars, activists, and artists we have assembled, including Noam Chomsky, Miroslav Volf, Linda Woodhead, Thomas Homer Dixon, and Essie Adujian. Today, we're going to reflect on the rich meanings of home. Of course, since many of us have been homebound for almost a year, we are all no doubt ready to be thinking together about this most mundane and yet this most magical space and idea. Indeed, at the national level in recent years, both US and Canadian societies have been forced to think carefully about what it means to be at home here in this place with these neighbors and with this shared history. We all watched in horror yesterday as, to quote a rather on-the-nose headline from Vanity Fair magazine, Trump unleashes fascist mob on Capitol Hill to overthrow democracy, which pretty much said it all. I hope these darkly pathetic efforts do not derail our conversation today, but I also hope that our conversation about what home might mean in North America today will take this attempted insurrection into account. We Canadians, of course, do not live in an ahistorical democratic utopia, and so as we prepare ourselves for Miroslav's reflections on home, I want to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now I'm very pleased to introduce you to today's speaker. Miroslav Volf is the Henry B. Wright Professor of Systematic Theology at Yale University and the founding director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. His books include Allah, A Christian Response, Free of Charge, Giving and Forgiving in a Culture Stripped of Grace, which was the Archbishop of Canterbury Lenten book for 2006, Exclusion and Embrace, a Theological Exploration of Identity, Otherness, and Reconciliation, and After Our Likeness, the Church as the Image of the Trinity. He was also co-author of For the Life of the World, which was the winner of the Christianity Today Book Award. Professor Volf has been involved in international ecumenical and interfaith dialogues and is an active participant in the Global Agenda Council on Values of the World Economic Forum. So today we have with us really a public intellectual with a special gift for connecting the personal and the political, and whose theological orientation we think will open up Christians and non-Christians to a rich discussion of what it might mean to live well together now in this place. Following the lecture, we have asked 3 of our colleagues to pose questions to Dr. Volf to consider as a way to open up the feature lecture to a broader engagement. These speakers include first, Dr. Brendan Nielsen, a theologian who is the vision animator of the Anglican Diocese of Islands and Inlets. He is also an associate fellow at the CSRS. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Natalia Morandiuk, who is assistant professor at Perkins School of Theology and author most recently of The Goodness of Home, Human and Divine Love and the Making of the Self. And finally, we'll hear from 2012 John Albert Hall speaker, Dr. Pamela Clausen, professor and chair of the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto and author of A Story of Radio Mind, A Missionary's Journey on Indigenous Land. In some sense, we can consider these three initial question askers as the front row of a town hall. After some discussion among Dr. Volf and our three friends, we'll open the conversation to the broader audience. Now, today we're using an enhanced Zoom platform that might be new to some of you. What this means in practice is that you are welcome to pose questions in the Q&A section of your screen, and then I will convey these questions to Dr. Volf. We'll turn off the chat function of the Zoom platform while Miroslav, Brendan, Natalia, and Pamela are engaged in conversation. And once the Q&A period has begun, we'll open up the chat function and you can respond to one another in the usual way. Now, for those of you who want to revisit the reflections you might hear tonight, please know that we will record and make the event available to the public by sometime next week. Now, before we turn the digital podium over to Miroslav, Brendan Nielsen will bring the greetings of the diocese. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. On behalf of the Diocese of Islands and Inlets, it's an honor for us to partner with the CSRS to sponsor these lectures. We do so thanks to a permanent endowment from the estate of the late John Albert Hall, who wished to foster the exploration of ideas at the intersection of faith and intellect. As the vision animator for the diocese, it is my task to help facilitate our journey of becoming a renewed people with renewed hearts and renewed spirits. A significant step along that journey is to be attentive to the conversations taking place at the intersection John Albert Hall envisioned. For it is in cultivating a curiosity and an understanding of what is at this intersection that allows us to revise our own questions about how to be faithful in this time and place. So we're deeply grateful to the center, and our partnership gives us access to the kinds of conversations it does. And on a personal level, I have regularly been inspired and challenged in wonderful ways through my fellowship. Along with its devastation and chaos, the pandemic has brought with it a handful of perks beyond the ability to attend events like this in our loungewear. It has provided the opportunity to host lectures in new ways and to involve more speakers from more places than it otherwise would be possible. The distinguished roster of contributors that Paul had mentioned makes this exemplified today with Professor Volf is now counted to be among the perks of the pandemic. So thank you all for being with us, and Professor Volf, the screen is all yours.
Brandon, thank you so much. And Paul, thank you also for your very kind words of introduction. I'm glad to be considered a perk, especially a perk of pandemic. So it's a kind of fantastic feeling, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, I miss seeing all of your faces and having this immediacy of experience. With you. I want to thank all of you who have put immense amounts of energy and time in organizing this, and it's wonderful to have events of this sort. I also want to thank my fellow panelists for their contributions, and I'm looking forward to learning from them. But I want to thank especially also for those of you who came and who are came electronically and have devoted time to this topic. And I hope that we can have a productive conversation. What I have to say is kind of, I'm in a sense on the way with this topic. I think it's one of the great topics of our time. In many ways, and I could go and expound why I consider this to be really central topic of our time. But that will take me too far. So I'll just give you some of my thoughts on being at home in the world. So here I start. There are times, however, in which utopia is the only realism. George Steiner ended with this sentence, an essay about the state of humanities in modern universities. The sentence is even more appropriate to our topic today. being at home in the world. There are, however, Steiner wrote. By this, however, he implied that there are also other ordinary times in which ordinary things happen as they ordinarily do. Reality is then reality, and utopia is then the very opposite of reality, a dream of a nowhere land, of a never land. But in times that only seem ordinary, because the out-of-jointness of things has been normalized, in times in which words like humanities or home have been hollowed out from inside, in such extraordinary times, the reality itself has become its own ghost. A utopian dream may then be the only way to hold on to reality, to return to reality. On one level, a home, topic of today, is very much a tangible reality. We can point to it. There it is. We say, bringing visitors for the first time to our place. This here is Miss Smith's home, and this right here next to it is our home. But despite having a home, for many of us, home is also a utopian dream. Any home is. What we describe as our home is often just a crash pad or an address, a place where we, in fact, don't feel particularly at home, a place inhabited by people who are not our home. When it comes to the larger world, the entire planet, then we often speak that entire planet is our only home. Yet we are often alienated from it. Except for occasionally enjoying a sunset over the island-strewn horizon of an ocean, or perhaps filling our lungs with fresh air while standing in awe before some majestic mountain, except in cases like these, the world strikes us as a cold and violent place, a threat more than a refuge. To imagine the world as home, we must dream of a social and material world different than the one we inhabit, of a different self than the one we actually are, of a different relationship between the self and the world than the one we in fact have. This lecture then is about a utopian dream of home, about the dream itself, about what keeps it from becoming reality, about a peculiar hope that may set us on a journey of making at least some of that dream into reality. Put slightly differently, the lecture is about how, in Tim Lilburn's words, how to know and love the world as home. And also, I would add, how to see and love it into becoming our home. One of the great thinkers of the world as home is Ernst Bloch, a Marxist philosopher who worked and wrote in the middle of the last century. For him too, home was an image of the world's wholeness and as such, a utopian dream. To use his own technical terminology, home exists only in the form of anticipation, or it is, but in the mode of not yet being. At the very end of his major work, The Principle of Hope, he gives this difficult philosophical idea a poetic expression. He writes, there arises in the world something which shines in the childhood of all and in which no one has yet been: home. Echoing experiences of happy early childhood, home pulls together many lines of human longing with respect to place and people into a single object of hope for what is not yet. All human history is, for Bloch, a story of human making the world into a genuine human home. That's the hope, at least. Ernst Bloch and George Steiner, two dreamers I have mentioned in these introductory remarks, were both Jewish thinkers. With the belief in the one God, the creator of the world, the Jews introduced into the world a transcendent ideal. In their interface with the great national catastrophes, slavery in Egypt and exile in Babylon, that transcendent ideal gave birth to prophetic visions, like God's great promise announced by the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah writes, "For I am," speaking in God's name, "for I am about to create new heavens and the new earth. Be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I'm about to create a Jerusalem as joy and its people as a delight. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it, or the cry of distress. They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, but the serpent, its food, shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, says the Lord." Now, secular Messianism, which both Bloch and Steiner embrace, is part of that Jewish prophetic tradition. Centuries earlier, that same tradition had given rise to the eschatological hopes of the early Christians. They reworked the story of Abraham, who left his father's house to become a pilgrim on the way to the land of promise. That's what we read in the book of Genesis. In the Christian rendering of that story, even while he was in the promised land, Abraham lived as a foreigner and in tents because he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. That city, the writer of Hebrews says, was his true homeland. Now skip 4 centuries with me and go to the church father Augustine, who gave this idea of home a classic expression: God's purpose for creating the world and the goal of entire history of the world is the journey of human beings to their true home. Augustine, and with him much of the Christian tradition, imagined the true home as an otherworldly reality. In contrast, ancient Hebrew prophets, the early Christian apocalyptic, and modern messianic thinkers all imagine the true home as a this-worldly reality. For both, however, and that's important, for both, however, the only world that would be right to call our home was a different world, not simply the world as it is, nor merely some slightly improved version of this world. For all of them, it is a radical idea, revolutionary idea, if we prefer. The idea to imagine home or world as our home. Over many centuries, from the ancient Hebrew prophets all the way to our own day, people have kept alive a dream of being at home in the world. But what do we mean by home? Home can be a house, a country, a language, a love, a longing, even grief, and of course, God. But as Chris Wyman wrote recently in his reflections on home, a word which means everything means also nothing. So to better clarify what we mean by home, let me offer a kind of a brief phenomenological description of what I understand under home. And I should add here that the lecture that I'm presenting was co-written with a collaborator of mine with whom I'm working on a large project about home, Dr. Ryan McAnally-Linz, who also works with me at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. If I slip into I include Ryan into that I hope I can stay with we, and you will not consider that to be a royal we, a kind of a self-imposition of greatness upon you, but a sign of honoring the one and giving honor to one to whom honor is due. Now, the first thing that comes to mind when we think of home today is likely an apartment or a house in which we live. Home is this physical space. But home is not just material dwelling place. Perhaps primarily, home is the people who live there. Often today, a nuclear family, parents and children, whether biological or adopted. Home is a social space. As both social and material spaces, homes are bounded. Fences and walls separate a particular home from the wider public space and divide one home from another. A roof shields it from the elements. Invisible but real boundaries also separate those who are members from those who are not. At the same time, the boundaries of homes must be passable, porous. Homes have doors for their members to leave and return, for the bounty of the earth and the fruits of others' labor to come in, and for garbage, of course, to go out. They have windows for the light to come in and air to circulate, and for people inside to see what's going on outside, whether that is a sun-bathed bluebird resting on the fence or a street with its bustling sidewalk. Take down boundaries, and the home is undone, merged with the world. Close all the openings, and it turns into a grave. Now, our description so far might suggest that the home is a particular cluster of entities, some alive and moving, others inanimate and stationary. But that's not quite right. True, without such entities, without a particular people and things, and in particular place, there wouldn't be anything to call home. A shopping cart and a place for a mat under a bridge are not a home, but the belongings and insecure territory of a vulnerable, homeless person. At the same time, you can have bounded material and social space and still be without home. Think of Napoleon in hell as C.S. Lewis imagines him in The Great Divorce, living in a palace as he himself has designed, pacing through its opulent, large, and well-lit rooms, and incessantly blaming everyone but himself for the abysmal failure of his grand ventures. Does that remind you of somebody? Like many wealthy people today, he has a splendid house, but no home. A patterned cluster of entities is not yet home. Crucial to home are active relations among these entities. Home is not a thing. Home is a vital process. Home happens among persons and between persons and other entities, whether living or inanimate. Now, the question then is, what are some of these key home constituting relations? First, I want to mention resonance. Resonance comes about when I am affected by a person or a thing, or a whole network of persons and things in such a way that I let myself be transformed in an encounter that I cannot and do not fully control. Simply put, relationships is resonant when the person or things speak to me. Now at home, many things speak to us. I can get the whiff of a smell from the kitchen or hear well-known steps approaching, and they tell me a story that makes me smile or maybe frown. I see a scratch on the table or feel a rug under my bare feet, and memory is triggered and I feel home. Second, home involves relations of strong attachment. I have a bond to the people and place that make up my home, like child does to his or her piggy, toy piggy. If they were to disappear from my life, I would feel diminished, often devastated, even at times bereft of the meaning of life. Because the fear of loss, and perhaps for other reasons as well, we tend to actively care for the people and things that make up home. I experience them in a deep and non-proprietary sense as mine. They belong to me not so much as what I, in an exclusive sense, have or possess, though that may be the case as well, but as part of who I am. Third, home requires mutuality. If resonance and attachment are one-sided, if only I resonate with people, but they do not resonate with me, if only I feel that they are part of me, but they don't feel that I'm part of them, I may be living in a place and cohabiting with others, but I would not be at home. I would not feel at home. I cannot properly feel at home with you if you don't feel at home with me. Similarly, if there is no shared vision about what belongs in the home and what should stay out, as well as about how boundaries are to be maintained, a sense of home would likely be lost. Finally, as a social and material space, home endures over time. A hotel suite is not a home unless we move in. A gathering for a pleasant social experience or kind of utilitarian association to better achieve some goal doesn't make one a member of a household. Home then is an enduring social and material space. And important for me is the nexus of sociality and materiality in the conception of home. So enduring social and material space, site of resonance, of attachment and mutuality. That idea, which is both reality and the utopian dream, is what makes me want to return home when I am away. That idea, too, is what makes me want to invest time and energy in homemaking, in creating, protecting, and cultivating relations that make home a reality. Homemaking, in this comprehensive sense, is a labor of love. It is a deeply rewarding but hard work when it comes to our nuclear homes. It is even harder work when it comes to our most encompassing home, which is the entire human family living on the blue planet. Now that's the vision, partly reality and partly dream of a home. Many forces conspire today to rob us of a sense of home. They're unhoming our world, undermining our efforts to cultivate even our small-scale homes, often even making it impossible for people to have a home, like that person with a shopping cart and a place for a mat under a bridge I mentioned earlier. I will briefly note only two such forces, two dynamics specific to modernity that reinforce alienation and loss of a sense of home. Sociologists identify them under the designation escalation and reification. Escalation and reification. Toward the end of the lecture, I will come to speak of some ancient and perennial threats to a vision of home. So this is now specifically modern threats, forces that unhome the world. In his various and learned writings, Hartmut Rosa has argued that to survive in modern societies, you have to live the way you ride a bicycle. You have to keep moving. The moment you stop, you fall. And not just moving at the pace that suits you, which is what you tend to do when you ride a bike. To live in modern societies, you have to keep moving faster and faster. What I have expressed here with the help of an image, Rosa states in a scholarly prose as follows: a modern society can only stabilize itself dynamically. Or more precisely, it can only reproduce its structure through an increase of some sort, quite regularly through economic growth, technological acceleration, and higher rates of cultural innovation. Now that's the dynamic of escalation. Now this modern escalation, Rosa argues, has two basic forms, and each makes difficult the kind of resonance, attachment, mutuality, and boundary maintenance needed for a sense of home. The first is, as we have just noted, acceleration of pace, of technological change, and also of life more generally. As a result, we never have enough time. Rosa writes, this is perhaps characteristic of everyday predicament of the overwhelming majority of people in Western capitalist societies, expresses it most aptly. Amidst monetary and technological affluence, they are close to temporal insolvency. Amidst monetary and technological influence, he's aware that there are also places where such things are not there, neither technology nor influence, but even folks who have that, or maybe especially folks who have that, they are close to temporal insolvency. We need more time to do our work properly. We need more time to improve our skills and knowledge, to renew our hardware and software. We need more time to care for our kids and elderly parents, more time for our friends and relatives, for our house or flat or for our body. And finally, we need more time to come to terms with ourselves, with our minds, with our souls, or with our psyches. Never enough time. Which is a short for who I am, what I do, and what I have is never good enough. Which means, in turn, there is no time when I truly feel at home. There is no place where I am truly at home. So acceleration of the pace of life goes hand in hand with an expansion of the scope of our engagement. And that's the second form of escalation. Nowadays, few of us live our lives with steady focus on social and material space that is our home. That was one of the benefits, one of the perks of COVID. Sometimes, mostly for better, I would hope, and sometimes for worse. It has forced this upon us, and to a degree that we are very much modern folks who are not used to that kind of life, it has created both opportunities and difficulties. A child of a globe-trotting parent might rightly complain that the difference between God and their parent is that God is everywhere, but their parent is everywhere except at home. We get the joke, except that the joke applies to the same complaining child holding smartphone in the living room. The pull of an expanded reach on both the parents and children make a sense of home elusive. By the way, make a sense of home of a faculty also elusive. And you can go at various levels of what we may consider analogically homes, have very similar experiences. Home needs time, home needs presence, but the logic of escalation and the acceleratory and in its acceleratory and expansive forms makes both difficult to get. So that's one dynamic of escalation. Now to reification. Sciences are a major way in which we today cognitively relate to the world. In the sciences, all entities appear as things, part of the web of causal relations. As Bruno Latour has noted recently, the sciences grasp all things from afar, from far away, as if they were external to the social world and completely indifferent to human concerns. Modern technology does the same. To a person with a hammer, all things look like a nail, the saying goes. To a person with a tool, all things become manipulable object. Modern medicine is a case in point. It treats human bodies as things, as manipulated, to be manipulated into wholeness. In a word, sciences and technology thingify everything they touch, which is the very definition of reification. Analogous forms of reification occur in other domains of modern life. In modern economics, the market has the tendency to turn everything into commodities, goods to be bought and sold. Marx is famous of in his work on that. For the market, even human persons are not sacred, but become mere object in the calculus of value. Similar kind of reification takes place in modern politics. As Michel Foucault observed in his late work, modern state tends to treat the population as its own vital resource. The health, the capacities, even happiness of individuals become concern for government for the sake of state's own security and development. Now, the point is not, at least my point is not, that modern sciences, technology, markets, and politics are uniformly bad, that we ought to dispense with them. In their own way, they do shelter us from exposure to forces that may crush us, and they thus provide something of what homes are designed to do. The point is rather that these powerful ways of relating cognitively and practically to the world reduce the world to a causally linked nexus of manipulable things. Relating to the world with their help, we stand before a mute universe with which it is difficult to resonate and to which it is hard to get attached. Modern sciences, technology, markets, and politics, they cast a spell. It's a strange thing to use with all these forces, but so it is, I think. They cast a spell on the world and all the living things in it, humans included, that make them, that makes, I'm sorry, let me repeat this. They cast a spell on the world and all the and on all the living things in it, humans included, that makes them, that spell makes them appear and feel like mere extended matter, as things we use but have hard time of loving and even really seeing for what they are. As Lilburn remarks, you cannot really see this stone if you believe the world is yours to do with it what you will. To turn reality into a world of things is to unhome not just the world, but any home we may think we may be able to build in it. Many have argued, plausibly in our view, that the dynamics of escalation and reification are the main cause of the current destruction of the environment. When plants and animals become mere things, we do with them whatever we please. And whatever we do with them, we have to do more of it and faster. No wonder that the earth reacts to our lack of respect by rage in the form of extreme weather phenomena, for instance. And since nobody can feel at home on a raging sea, our ability to feel at home in the world is further diminished thereby. If home matters to us, we must resist the dynamics of escalation and reification. The only alternative is to look, often the only alternative is to look for some sort of escape. Radical forms of transhumanism, for instance, seem to have given up on any vision of home. Instead, they imagine human survival in knowledge or in data, detached from any form of carbon-based life. Alternatively, some of the super rich seem to be laying the groundwork for some kind of a secular rapture, departure from this overpopulated, ecologically devastated, war-plagued Earth and settlement in peaceful colonies in space with weather all year around like Maui on its best day. For the rest of us, by far, the most convenient form of escape is the pretense of normalcy, going on as if our struggles and pleasures, with our struggles and pleasures, as if we didn't live on the Niagara River, to use the image, an image that Kay Ryan employed in the poem by the same name. As though, here's the poem, as though the river were a floor, we position our table and chairs, position them upon it and eat and have conversation. As it moves along, we notice, as calmly as though dining room paintings were being replaced, the changing scenes along the shore. We do know this is the Niagara River, but it's hard to remember what that means. If, like me, you hear the distant roar, and if home matters to you, I hope that you will want to resist the unhoming that we are experiencing. Now, to resist the unhoming of the world, we need resources. Above all, I think we need guiding visions of home as a social and material site of wholeness and of flourishing. One kind of such resources we can find in indigenous forms of wisdom that do not work with the transcendent ideal associated with Jewish monotheism, or for that matter, other so-called axial transformations. We can learn a great deal from indigenous wisdom. But I'm a Christian theologian, so in the remainder of this lecture, I will explore resources from the Christian Bible, specifically those that come from a vision of the world as home in the book of Revelation. The seer is John of Patmos. What he sees is a different kind of world, inhabited by different kind of selves, and suffused with the presence of God. What he sees is a material and social space which is God's home and human home in one. Now, an attentive reader of the last chapters of the book of Revelation will easily detect in John's visions plentiful echoes of the stories of exile and hopes of homecoming, about which we read in the Hebrew Bible, and which, as I earlier said, gave impetus both to Christian eschatology and to secular messianism. Writing at the end of the first century of the Common Era, John of Patmos presents us with a contrast between Babylon, the city of Israel's exile, and Jerusalem, the city of Israel's homecoming. But he gives each city a twist. Babylon is also a symbolic reference to the Roman Empire, and Jerusalem has morphed into the New Jerusalem, the object of Christian eschatological expectation. Now, the dystopian vision of Babylon, dominated by forces which have from ancient times been and still remain enemies of home, dystopian vision of Babylon is designed to nudge his readers to direct their hopes toward the New Jerusalem. Now, I know that many of you listening here me speak may not be Christians. I trust that the vision of two cities will still be of interest to you, help you dream your own version of a world as home. Now, I will frame my presentation around themes that are implicated in anyone's vision of home. Themes such as rule, such as wealth, attunement or lack of it with nature, competition, desire, glory, ultimate values, and more. I'll try to kind of signal these themes for you rather than running through a kind of summarizing commentary of those sketches. Let's start with the unhomed world of Babylon. Though on the surface it may seem that John is concerned mainly with debauchery of the city, sensuality grown wild, he excoriates primarily Babylon's politics, economics, religion, and between the lines, its treatment of nature. Take first rule. Babylon is the world capital. It rules over the peoples and multitudes and nations and languages, and it rules by military force, by deception, and by seduction. Consider wealth. It is consumed with desire for wealth. Desire it has in common with kings and magnates over whom it rules and with whom it cooperates and trades. The city is dressed in or fills itself with the finest of things, from gold to spices, from silk and scarlet to horses and chariots, from pearls and ivory to frankincense and wine, from cattle to slaves. Consider its glory. The rule and wealth are, however, not just about control and possession. They're also about glory. They're also about self-portrayal in splendor. And nature? What is conspicuously absent is nature that isn't manipulated and processed into service of human ends. Everything in the city is manufactured and controlled. And even humans are hidden behind the glitter of artificiality that give them some kind of fake gilded glory. And then ultimate values, decked in jewels, and clothed in purple and scarlet, Babylon tolerates no alternative set of values besides the beastly obsession with power, wealth, and glory. The golden cup of its full of abomination it holds is filled with the blood of prophets and saints. Babylon's throne is a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, and the city is doomed to become a dwelling place of demons. In contrast to Babylon is New Jerusalem, the home of God among humans. Its ultimate value, well, John sees the whole New Jerusalem as a holy of holies, the part of an ancient Israelite temple where God's presence rested. God dwells in the city, and the entire city dwells in God. Rule. Consequently, when John envisions God and the Lamb, that is Jesus Christ ruling from the throne, they don't rule merely from the outside. And they certainly do not rule by military might or with the help of deception as Babylon does. They rule from within the true selves of the people in whom they dwell, the selves which have the law of love written into their very fabric. If you read early Karl Marx economic philosophical manuscripts, then you will see here kind of coincidence of individual and common and global kind of interests imply. This implies that all people rule together with God, which is to say that no one rules over anyone. Nations are not subdued and robbed of their glory. They walk in the light of God, and through the open gates, they bring their glory and honor into the city. And now wealth, even more than Babylon, New Jerusalem is opulent, full of gold, crystal, and precious stones. Too much of it, I think, for my taste, even for a vision. But nobody's getting rich by trading or at the expense of someone else, because as in any good home, everything is equally accessible to everyone. The water of life is available for free as a gift. Nature, the New Jerusalem is an urban area, but it is not entirely artificial, manufactured space. It is a garden city. The river of the water of life flows from the throne of God and the Lamb through the middle of the city. On either side of the river is a tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, and the leaves of the trees are for the healing of nations. You see the Garden of Eden restored, expanded, and integrated into a city. It is a vision of harmony between civilization and nature. Consider now the place of competition. The true citizens of Babylon desire the goods of Babylon, power, wealth, and glory, as I said earlier. But in Babylon, these goods are only accessible through Babylon's own organization of social life, which is to say, under the condition of competition in a zero-sum game. Babylonian desire is not just to have more power, wealth, and glory, but to have more than others. That's what propels Babylon's dynamic of escalation. No matter how much Babylon's goods in Babylon are desired, Babylon can never become home. In fact, the more Babylonians desire those goods and the longer they seek to acquire them the way they do, the less like home Babylon will feel. For no matter how much wealth Babylon creates, since its citizens neither long for what they have nor share it for others, they can never come to feel at home in it. Goods that unite are characteristic of the New Jerusalem in contrast. There, everything is shared. Rule, the wealth, the goods of nature, they're all shared. Everything is always already possessed by everyone. What's more, the nested set of relations of God's indwelling in persons, communities, and entire heaven and earth unites each with all in a vision, in reality, and in longing, so that the flourishing of each is predicated on flourishing of all, and vice versa. If you desire the goods that belong to all and unite all, you will feel at home in the New Jerusalem. You will be a true Jerusalemite. But Babylonians will hate New Jerusalem. Perhaps in a way, Nietzsche, the great proponent of struggle, hated empathy. So Babylonians will hate New Jerusalem, and living in it, they would feel hemmed in, alienated from themselves. Like the merchants mourning the demise of Babylon in Revelation 18, if they ever found themselves in the New Jerusalem, they would long to return to Babylon, the unhomed city of competitive struggle. So you have a contrast between Babylon and New Jerusalem. There's a competition of sorts in Revelation as to which city is more beautiful, lushly adorned, though both are impressive in their own way. Still, Babylonians will despise the New Jerusalem and the Jerusalemites, and despise them precisely for their wanting home and being at home. Inversely, too, Jerusalemites will disdain Babylon and perhaps pity the Babylonians for failing to have a desire to have a home. The contrast between Babylon and New Jerusalem is between attitudes of Babylonians and Jerusalemites toward each other is a reminder that a vision of home is a vision of life governed by a table of values that are set within a given account of reality. And these tables of values and accounts of realities may collide, resulting for very different visions of what it means to be a home and whether home is desirable. Let me conclude. One way to describe where we find ourselves at the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century is to say that we live in a modern and global version of John's Babylon. Some of us may find ourselves comfortable in it, but many will not, and none of our progeny will have much of a future in such a world. Others may long for something like the New Jerusalem, while knowing all too well that we cannot build it. John of Patmos knew that as well. He saw that city not being built up from the ground up, but coming down out of heaven from God. But even if we cannot create New Jerusalem, even if we don't believe that anything is going to come from heaven, from God, we can still start living in the light of its vision. If we do, the promise of the biblical traditions is that we come to know and love, that we will come to know and love the world as our home, both the home that it already is and the home that it is yet to become. Thank you.
Thank you, Miroslav. That was beautiful. Beautiful. So now we have let's maybe spend 10 or so minutes in conversation between yourself and three others. So let's begin with Brendan. I think we're going to have some of them pinned.
Thank you, Miroslav, for that beautiful and enticing exposition of what is home. I guess I wanted to ask around some of these comments that appeared frequently throughout your talk, such as natural and almost some things that seemed unnatural or counternatural, such as these forces of reification and what was the other one there? Escalation that you mentioned, almost kind of an unnatural type of forces that go against what would naturally be occurring in the world and creation. And also supernatural, I think, is another one that kind of comes in here in behind. Not that you mentioned it explicitly, but I guess it just makes me think of some of, I guess, panentheism, really, and some of the work of Catherine Keller and Sally McFaig and the like, who almost take a version of God being in all things as a kind of return to this vision of God as available in all things natural. And I guess I just wanted to put that to you. Does that come in here quite naturally, or does that change any of the comments that you would have from that perspective?
No, I do have affinity with folks who work with kind of more panentheistic vision. Jürgen Moltmann, my own teacher, has those kinds of tendencies. He's always appreciated process theology. You know, so I don't see these kind of traditions as unfriendly, as enemies, and in any way kind of unfriendly to the trajectory in which I'm trying to go. And indeed, though I haven't quite explicated that more thoroughly, but part of the vision is this vision of the New Jerusalem in which is suffused by God's presence, which itself dwells in God, so that though there is a distinction between divine and creaturely, which to me is a very significant one, nonetheless, there's no opposition, and so that the relationship between divine and creaturely can be seen as one of creaturely fulfillment rather than kind of creaturely evacuation of themselves and who they properly are. I don't know whether that in any way helps or not. So I'm happy to work with a kind of categorical distinction between God and the world, but not with radical separation between the two. In a sense, I think I'm closer to my colleague Kathy Tanner, which would argue that precisely the transcendence of God makes possible the forms of immanence that are non-competitive and can come to the good of the world as it is indeed, not to the good from kind of outside, but are constitutive of the very well-being of what the world as created world is.
Okay, Natalia.
Yes, Miroslav, thank you for this presentation. So you juxtapose dehoming or unhoming practices with home, which perhaps might be homing, as you described, as a dynamic process rather than an activity rather than a stasis. And then you map that on the distinction between the imagery from Revelation of Babylon and Jerusalem. But how do we get from Babylon to Jerusalem? What kind of transformation is necessary? And I have two subsidiary questions, well, with a preface. So in the Christian tradition from which you draw to make the arguments that you do, the transition is soteriological. There is a conversion of the state of affairs in which the world finds itself or human beings within it, or globally speaking. Is that the sort of move that we might want to imply here, or something else? And you do mention a couple of things here and there. For example, you speak of resistance briefly, and you quote from Revelation a number of things, including that imagery of the tree of life with the leaves that are for the healing of nations. So healing is what I resonated with, to use some of your language. So I wonder, perhaps healing if that is part of maybe a way of transitioning from one city to another, from dehoming to homing. Healing of what? And in what way? Uh, Lastly, and I promise to be brief, it's a cluster of three things. Lastly, you speak about a different sort of self that resides in the New Jerusalem. So is it a healing of the self, perhaps a transformation of the self? And if so, is it sufficient? And how does the self relate to home, to start with, more robustly? You speak about the self as being indwelled by God, God ruling it, having the law of love inscribed in the self. Well, Augustine brings these three together precisely: home, love, and the self as a triad. How would you bring them together? And is just the self to be transformed, or also structures such as patriarchy, such as white supremacy, such as queerphobia, oligarchic capitalism, and all these other horrific things? That's my cluster of questions.
Thank you. So that's at least 3 lectures to answer this question, but I'll just briefly suggest kind of the trajectories of my own thinking about that. So I think we do need to have a different kind of self, right? You can imagine. You can imagine yourself, and indeed that's how I imagine the story of Garden of Eden, a kind of placed in a perfect world, but being malcontent for reasons that we can kind of conjecture and guess. And if the relationship between if home is a relationship between self and the world, and all 3 of these elements are significant, I think it's a very important thing to think about transformation, inner transformation of desire. For instance, one of my favorite lines from Paradiso early on is when I'm gonna be giving 3 lectures. That's not very good where I'm headed with it now. That's just 1/10 of your question, and but this may be significant. I'll be short on others. You know, it comes up when the souls who are in lower ranks of heaven. They don't know. Dante is kind of puzzled. They don't feel envious of what's going on up in the higher regions. And the response of the souls is, and I use that line without referencing Dante, also in this text, is we long for what we have. A kind of fundamental stance of longing for what one has is a condition of possibility of home. Indeed, I think it's a condition of possibility of any form of satisfaction. Now, that comes the other part of it, because I didn't talk only about different self. I talked about the different world. And for me, that is really fundamental, right? So it's not, how do I make myself feel at home in the world? And there's much work that can be done on this. Tim Lilburn's book is very interesting in this regard, and looking in the eyes of a doe, right? How does one see the world as what the world is? You need transformation of the self. But I say you need another world too, right? A different kind of world, which is to say a different kind of materiality, different kind of set of relationships that constitute the world. And then all these different things that you mentioned come into it. And the comments on Babylon versus New Jerusalem tells you of a kind of revolution in forms of rule, valuation on economic goods, how they're distributed. All of this, I think, needs to happen for the home to be properly home. Different world and different self, and different set of relationship between the two. So I think, to me, that's partly why I think that the metaphor of home is so incredibly interesting. If you think of it as a kind of nexus of social, personal, obviously, and social and material in one particular place, right? Even universally. Other question is about transition from the one on the other. You know, I have a little bit more about both Babylon and Jerusalem, and maybe I should have left that piece, but the text was getting a bit longer. Where I want to say that they are portrayed as contrasts, but actually that they're almost like something loosely analogous to a pure type. they are kind of caricatures of contrast. We all Babylonians and Jerusalemites, to use that vocabulary, all at one, and in some area move in one direction and the other. And I think even in our deepest desires, we are often split and don't quite know how to negotiate that split, which is to say that we have already in us the conditions of possibility of movement toward in one direction, of both of undoing and also of unhoming, and also of cultivating, creating home. And indeed, most of us do that. When we live in our homes, we cultivate and we unhome at the same time. Now, that is a kind of creation theological, if you want, justification of or account of the transition. There may be also consummation kind of account of transition. They may be also soteriological kind of transition, but they're not contrasts to me. There are united the three modes in which we can come to participate and move from the unhomed world to world that is our home.
Thanks, Miroslav. Okay, Pamela Clausen has the last question before we turn it to the larger group.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Miroslav, for that very interesting lecture. I too would have, 5 or 6 different questions. So I'll try to keep it to sort of one. So I'm work more historically, anthropologically in the context of the study of religion. And as you're talking, I realized I've written a lot about home. I've thought a lot about home, and I haven't really thought of myself as that kind of person, but I worked on home birth, women giving birth in the home. I've written more recent articles thinking about religion, and it was actually one of these volumes you could ask to write an essay for, and it was a whole volume on the cultural history of the home. So I'll send you that whole, whole link to all of those other lectures. And I got to do religion. But what it prompted me for, and this is, I guess, maybe a little less, not necessarily dystopian, but just a little more suspicious of the utopian home, because homes are at once these sort of sites of sanctuary and sites of suspicion. We don't quite know what goes on in homes always, and you never really know, right? And so in the version that you're, the version of homing and unhoming, I liked that, Natalia, the homing idea that you're talking about. There is this, you are working with these kind of dualisms where we are moving towards something that is moving towards the utopia. I mean, even the Babylonian and the New Jerusalem contrasts are, you just sort of said they're actually more connected than dualistic, but they're clearly also very dualistic and very gendered, both in the Book of Revelation and in our in contemporary discourse as well, where you have the whore of Babylon and the bride of New Jerusalem. And so there's a lot going on. When one gets to the metaphor of home, I think one has to really be thinking about gender and making gender much more explicit in the conversation, especially when you think about the ways that the home has been understood in Christian theological or Christian context, in which it's there's often much a very strong sort of valorization of the home, but also I guess you could say the home is not the most important site of ritual activity in Christianity, and I think that's something that would be worth thinking about within this lens of Christian theology, and that sort of denigration is in and of itself a kind of gendered one. That, however, is not my question. So I'll get to my question really quickly now. I want you also to think about the groundedness of home. And this really comes, I think, from thinking about settler colonial contexts and what it means to claim home on land that has been stolen or in which treaties have not been recognized or honored. And that is for people who think about that, it's a very discomforting notion of home. And so I would love to hear more about when you said that very briefly, that we can learn a lot from Indigenous perspectives on, did you say Indigenous perspective on home or Indigenous, whatever it was that you said? I would love to know a little more about that and how how Christian theologian thinks about home in this context, given the history of Christian ambitions to make homes around the world without necessarily realizing who was there first and who's still there.
Yeah. No, thank you for that that question. That's I think that's a really important question. The whole kind of colonial studies and how home figures in the kind of colonial project, but how home figures also in what the colonial project is destroying, right? Because there are kind of images also of home and the land and the connection with the land, kinds of attachments and resonances that I'm describing as a home are the kinds of attachments and resonances that you often find in Indigenous people's relationship to the space, to the land. Everything speaks, and I think that idea that things are not just things, that things aren't kind of the anti-reificatory push that is kind of fundamental to non-reificatory form of life that is fundamental to Indigenous communities, to my understanding, is what needs to be retrieved. So that once we can recognize in just ordinary things, even in ordinary manufactured things, that they are not just things, that there's something shining beyond what they are. That seems to me, if you want a pagan kind of idea, retrieval self-paganism of this sort, which I find very congenial to my project. If you look at with somebody like Dreyfus and Kelly, All Things Shining, you'll get some of that sense, kind of ordinary sense of shimmering of things. That is a modern phenomenological way of retrieving something that has been fundamental in indigenous traditions. So, and the sense that sense of home has been violated, and sense of home has been violated in the name of certainly with justification of Christianity, but has been violated in the name of plunder of the land and possession of the land. It had to be done, it had to be made into something it isn't, so that it could be divided and rendered as potential for property and for acquisition and for colonization, for settlement. I mean, settler colonialism is based on plunder, right? And certain forms of relation to the land have played a significant role just in justifying this. So I find this deeply troubling experience that deserves and must be seriously critiqued. But if you kind of step back and look at realities of any of our homes, that obviously is the kind of in countries like United States and Canada. It's not in country where I come from, right? We were the occupied, you know. Turkish Empire ruled 500 years over the piece of land where I was. My people were sold into slavery in order to be the soldiers for the Turkish armies. You know, so I'm quite familiar with how this goes. Obviously, it's not comparable to the experiences of indigenous population and more broadly kind of settler colonialism, which certainly Turkish Ottoman Empire wasn't. But in any case, if you think of how ambivalent any home reality is, whether that's a nation, which are to me terribly ambivalent categories, or that's even personal home, or even personal possession, or even what I wear as I speak to you, and even where I teach and so forth. I can go down the line, and the fissure will go straight through everything that I have and everything also that I am. Now, that's the reality also of our lives, that we are always already caught in the snare, always already not who we are supposed to be, but always already striving to be what we and overcome it. How to then nurture our better angels, and what to do with the past. What do memories do? What do we do with memories? What do memories do to us? What obligations we have for the sins of our foreparents? All of these are tremendously important and troubling questions for me.
Thanks very much, Miroslav. So we have about 12 minutes before people have to go get their dinner sorted out. So I want to go to the Q&A section. And we have a question from Jennifer Waterman, who asks, could you comment on the emphasis in Christianity and Islam on the life in heaven or the afterlife for which we should prepare versus the Jewish emphasis on tikkun olam, on repairing the world and repairing this world in particular?
So Christian tradition certainly is very diverse in this. There are strands of the Christian tradition, important strands, to which I don't belong, against which I push, which think of something like the eschatology in terms of the soul's union with God. It's a venerable and very tradition. It can be used to undermine flourishing in this world. It can be developed, as for instance, my colleague Kathy Tanner does, in ways that doesn't. I'm not going to be able to speak fully for Muslim tradition, but I would want to argue, and that's partly what I suggested in my lecture when I said, to the extent that early Christians build on Jewish prophets, it's very much a this world, the tikkun olam, kind of reality and messianic hope for that. I think something similar is the case with early Christian communities. As far as I can tell, everywhere in the New Testament, it's not future of a soul with God. It is a kind of transformed reality of this world. And in that sense, I see very much continuity with Jewish tradition, and very happily stand in that community. And that was also what I wanted to imply by saying that in the book of Revelation, I mean, if you read those chapters, they're full of references from Ezekiel in particular, and from and as well Isaiah and other prophets. And I want to build on that. That's what I'm interested in highlighting.
Thank you. Adam Creswell also asks, can you comment on the juxtaposition of this idea of home and the depiction of God offering no rest, i.e. Deuteronomy 28:65, where it writes, among those nations you shall find no ease, no resting place for the sole of your foot. There the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and a languishing spirit.
But doesn't that describe experiences of many people? Refugees today. There are places and there are peoples among whom you will have a trembling heart. I mean, I just finished reading a book, in a belated way, about the Great Migration, and African American experience seems to me just that. Obviously, very complex in many ways, but kind of sense of not being able to find a home because there's somebody who is preventing you from being at home, who's made it systematic project of their of how they imagine who they are as a community to interfere in you finding a place for yourself and being at home. I mean, yeah, and I would say this is one of the great unhoming trajectories of the especially of the Western world. And if I were to add more forces in the modern world, certainly colonialism and racism would have been among those that I would develop. So that to me seems right. What I would push against is to make this kind of a paradigmatic of experience as a whole in the world. And that certainly could not be justified by reference to Hebrew Bible or in biblical traditions more generally.
So Ali Castillo writes, you said for the modern man, home is normalcy. If I am understanding this correctly, you are insisting that normalcy is a form of escapism that hinders us from actually getting to home. How then are we to apply this in our lives? Coming back to Natalia's point, is there a soteriological method, or are you suggesting that so that we can overcome normalcy as a form of escapism and return home?
Can you repeat the very first
Sure.
line of that question? I didn't get what the premise.
He's quoting you as saying for the modern man home. He's quoting you as saying for the modern man home is normalcy. Then he asks, if I'm understanding this correctly, you are insisting that normalcy is a form of escapism in some sense that hinders us from getting actually home. Or is that a misreading of your argument?
I think so. I think there are forms of being at home that are escapist. And that's what I was trying to suggest. That there are ways. I mean, the point I was trying to make is with these two forces, escalatory and acceleratory. Reification and escalation as two forces that unhome the world. I mean, one way to relate to them is simply to seek some form of escape. And there are multiple, I named 3 forms of escape, and we kind of normalize this kind of escapism. I would want us to be alert to that, partly because I think that those kinds of forces are undoing the world as a whole, and therefore we need to have a kind of sense of awareness and offer resistance. As my invitation is not to say that home is normalcy, but that the unhoming forces are normalized sometimes in order for us to feel okay with ourselves, rather than engaging in a struggle, which I think would also take us away from the zones of comfort. In the Christian tradition, Jesus was if you consider Jesus being on a mission of creating something like Kingdom of God, he was homeless. Elective homelessness, right? Which is to say, we are now in a stage where we need struggle, not just for our homes, but for the world as a home. That entails a certain kind of both a vision of home, recognition of how it's broken, and willingness not to be satisfied with some kind of private escapist happiness, while everything else is being destroyed.
Thank you. Victor Nuccio asks, the Sabbath seems to be a rejection of human economic structures. Can the biblical Sabbath work then as a tool that moves us towards some kind of home?
Yeah, I think Sabbath is very important, but the question is how, in principle, I think Sabbath and work are part of home, right? Our problem is that we have forgotten what Sabbath means. But you can have home without without the work of home. Kind of Sabbath in the eschatological sense in a Christian tradition is obviously Sabbath as imagination of fulfillment. But if you think of it as a kind of realistic, any form of realistic eschatology or any form of home that is workable, you will have to do the work of being at home, of cultivating home. If you you know, my doctoral work early on was on Karl Marx's concept of work. You can see him struggling with that question in the communist society, but there's going to be a need to be work and not alienated work. Home is the kind of space, we have to imagine it, in which we can have something like liberated work where we at work are truly ourselves, rather than simply think of no work. That has to be balanced, of course, with Sabbath, which is a celebration of what is. The work is maintenance of the thing that they can be possibly improved or remain what they are. But Sabbath is a celebration of the beauty of the isness, of the goodness of what is there before us.
Thanks very much, Miroslav. So I want to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your really quite rich thoughts with us on home. And I want to thank Brendan, Natalia, and Pamela as well for sort of beginning the conversation. I really appreciate that. We're very fortunate to be able to have you join us tomorrow at the CSRS for some teasing out of the conversation today. So thanks also for that. Now, Scott, can we put up the slide for the next two talks? And I'm afraid I didn't get to all the questions in the question and answer panel, but I'll try to pose some of them tomorrow to Miroslav in our coffee discussion.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're just going to give you some sense of what's coming up. Mike or Scott? There we go. So that's today. So our next John Albert Hall lecture is February 2nd on Tuesday. It is Noam Chomsky, so please join us for that. You'll see there the little link that you have to go to register. So please do that in advance if possible, and you will be sent the notification of how to get on, just as you were for today's talk. So looking forward to seeing you there. And just so you know, every week we have one and sometimes two of these talks. And I think there's another slide that gives you some sense of what's coming up next week. So next week is one of our in-house fellows who's going to be, it's Françoise Keating, who is a PhD candidate. She's going to be giving a lecture on creating a civil society, René d'Anjou, and religious rebirth. So feel free to join us for that next week. The link is on our website. So looking forward to seeing some of you next week, and certainly to seeing you for the Noam Chomsky talk in about a month. Thanks, everybody, and I wish you all a safe travel home, whatever home means to you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, folks.